cutting Biden's feed and go woke or go broke? This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. And I'm happy to say this podcast has a title of Who's Cutting Biden's Feed? We talked about this yesterday on the podcast. Just to let you know, podcast listeners, I'm very proud of the fact that I was really the first podcast to actually begin talking about this based on this latest clip from Biden where his feed was cut. And then, shockingly, after yesterday's podcast, I'm not saying that this is what they watched to ask the question, but Senator James Rich from Idaho started asking Secretary of State Blinken about this very issue. I thought this is interesting, right? Because Blinken was on Capitol Hill yesterday talking about who bungled Afghanistan, who's in charge, who made the really bad decisions on the ground, who was in charge of the strategic decision to give up Bagram Air Force Base and instead evacuate from Kabul, among many other decisions, right? So that was what I thought was going to be asked of State Department Secretary of State Blinken. And it was, of course. I mean, he was definitely held to account and he was grilled and so forth. But the interesting thing is, yesterday's podcast, we're talking about in a segment about how Biden's feed was cut when he was speaking about wildfires. And then yesterday, Blinken is grilled on the issue of who's really in charge. Like, you know, if Afghanistan was bungled, which of course it has been bungled with respect to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And certainly we can all make the same argument that it has been bungled for many years because the government fell in 2 weeks in Afghanistan. And we've been propping this government up forever and training its military and its police force and trying to create structures and helping them pave the way with improved infrastructure and kind of a civilized society. It all fell apart in 2 weeks. And the Taliban took over. And apparently we didn't know that was going to happen. And so that's why State Department Blinken, Secretary of State, was there. But Senator James Rich decided to use this as an opportunity to ask the question that we asked yesterday, which is, who is really in charge? Who's cutting Biden's feed? Who's cutting his feed when he's talking? Who is that guy? So here's Senator James Rich of Idaho. And we have several clips from this. You are really going to be intrigued by this, podcast listeners, because he's right on point. And it goes to the broader issues of the deep state, in my opinion. Here's the first clip. Here it is.
Look, we've all seen this. We saw it as recently as yesterday. Somebody in the White House has authority to press the button and stop the president, cut off the president's speaking ability and sound. Who is that person?
I think anyone who knows the president, including members of this committee, knows that he speaks very clearly and very deliberately for himself.
So that's why we have this particular group of clips in the daily Biden dumpster fire, because you have the Secretary of State say, very smugly, I think everyone who knows Joe Biden knows he does a good job of speaking very clearly for himself. He does? He speaks clearly? He really is speaking for himself? He comes out with index cards to remind him of what he's supposed to even talk about and who's there in the room. So the smug Secretary of State, and you can tell by his smirk that he is smug, and you can also tell that he is mocking the system, which means he's undermining the United States of America when you have a president of the United States who isn't really in charge, which goes again to that deep state that we started talking about at the beginning of the podcast. Well, we're going to continue with Senator James Rich's questions of Secretary of State Blinken. And the senator from Idaho, Senator James Rich, I guess, is that how you say it? Is it Reich or Rich? It's R-I-S-C-H, so it could be Reich, it could be Rich. He asked the question, How about the reporting of the president's microphone feed being cut? So it goes right to the point. Again, we have that clip, and here it is.
Well, are you saying that there's no one in the White House that can cut him off? Because yesterday that happened, and it's happened a number of times before that. It's been widely reported that somebody has the ability to push the button and cut off his sound and stop him from speaking. Who is that person?
There is no such person. Again, the president speaks for himself, makes all of the strategic decisions, informed by the best advice that he can get from the...
So that's Blinken. He's like, well, the president makes all those decisions for himself. How would Secretary of State Blinken really know? I mean, is he in the know? And if he is in the know, then he's also partly responsible for whomever this person is, which, by the way, the senator from Idaho, James Rich, asks that question. Are you aware of who this is? Are you aware of this? We had that clip. It's about a minute long, folks. It is worth listening to this exchange because it goes to a broader question that we all feel is happening. And we felt that it was also happening under the Trump administration, too, and now under the Biden administration. And we'll go to that in a minute. But first, here's the clip.
The people around him.
So are you unaware that this is actually happening? Because it happened yesterday at the Interagency Fire Center. It was widely reported. The media's reported on it, and it's not the first time it's happened. It's happened several times. Are you telling this committee that this does not happen, that there's no one in the White House who pushes the button and cuts him off in mid-sentence?
That's correct.
So this didn't happen yesterday, nor on the other occasions where the media showed the American people that his sentence was cut off in mid-sentence. Yeah. Are you saying that didn't happen?
Senator, I really don't know what you're referring to. All I can tell you is, having worked with the president for now 20 years, both here on this committee and over the last 9 months at the White House, the president very much speaks for himself.
The president very much speaks for himself. That was not the question. The question is, are you aware of the president of the United States, when he was just at the wildfires briefing, having his feed cut off? Are you aware of who is in charge of cutting his feed and the fact that that happened at that specific meeting? And of course, Blinken is like, guy, the president speaks for himself. And once again, smug. I mean, the people around Joe Biden understand that there's a problem, but it also makes you wonder about the broader issue of the deep state and who's really in charge. Who's cutting Biden's feed? Well, we played this clip yesterday. We're going to play it again. This is what they're all talking about. This is what Senator Rich is talking about. This is why he's asking Secretary of State Blinken about, which is Biden at a wildfires briefing who starts asking a question, and then that mysterious person pulls the feed, cuts it off. Here's the clip.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
One of the things that I've been working on with some others is...
Can I ask you a question? It's like Grandpa Simpson. Can I ask you a question? One of the things that I was, wondering about is, and it's like, uh-oh. And then that mysterious person then cuts the feed. Folks, who is running the show? Who is in charge of the president of the United States? And I believe that it is the Obama people that are surrounding him and the Obama people that are in charge, and the Obama people that are giving the Obama acolytes in the government advice on how to manage Joe Biden's failing memory. And yes, we've talked about this before, but do you understand how important this is? We have a guy who is not in charge. He's not in charge. Yet, at the same time, we read that General Milley was somehow in the Trump administration responsible for a potential coup So in the Daily Wire, General Milley was worried that Trump would go rogue, and he warned China's top general in secret, a secret back channel with phone calls. So this is in the Daily Wire, and it's directly connected to the current president and occupant of the United States, Joe Biden, because General Milley is still around. So here's the article. In their new book, Peril, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa claim that General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was so concerned that then President Donald Trump would go rogue and spark a war with China that he made a pair of secret phone calls to his counterpoint in China, per the Washington Post. Quote, Woodward and Costa write that after January 6, Milley felt no absolute certainty that the military could control or trust Trump and believed it was his job as the senior military officer to think the unthinkable and take any and all necessary precautions. So Milley thought it was the job of the military to control the president of the United States. And this is the same guy who's largely in charge of the retreat from Afghanistan, General Milley. This is also the guy who, in the previous administration, the Trump administration, has done everything to sandbag President Trump, and, he's still there. Deep state, folks. There's apparently a group of people in our military at the highest levels, and I have no doubt at the CIA and the NSA and in the State Department, who think they are the ones who are in charge of running the United States of America. Not the civilians, not the civilian elected official like Trump, and then, of course, Joe Biden. It is Joe Biden's job to run the country. I mean, he is the president. And I know that there are podcast listeners out there who's like, no, he's not my president. Just like there were podcast listeners that said, no, Trump's not my president. But you do want the president, the guy that's in the White House, to at least be in charge, to be making the decisions. And so then the question is, who is pulling and cutting Biden's feed? Who's running the government? And I said this yesterday, and I mean this sincerely. It's definitely not Joe Biden. And I think that Donald Trump was such an incredible surprise to the deep state that when he got elected, they made sure that they tried to get him off track constantly so that he wouldn't try to bring the civilian government, the control of the civilian government and the control of the military and the deep state and control of the National Security Agency and the CIA and the FBI under his presidency. He's the leader. He's the leader of the free world. And this brings, so here's the problem, podcast listeners. And I know that you're thinking this. Here's the problem. We have Democrats and we have the military saying, we want to get rid of white supremacy. And I'm not really sure what that means, of course. I mean, to me, a white supremacist would be somebody who would be like a Nazi or a Klansman. And obviously, that's not a good thing. And I would agree. That's a really bad thing. But really what they're saying when they say white supremacy, they want to get rid of anyone who supported Donald Trump or supports the idea that the civilians in this country, the working men and women, want to take back Washington and want to control it. They want to tame it. They want to stop it from ruining our country. And it's the general thoroughly modern Millies of the world who are responsible in part for this. Others, I'm sure, in the top brass. And as I said, the CIA, NSA, FBI. I mean, it's quite frankly frightening. And it's clear to me that Obama set this up in his 8 years. And naturally, they have their dream candidate in there now, which is a guy that's, not all there, and they can pull all the strings, including pull the feed. So, next up, podcast listeners, Newsom defeats Elder. This is a big shame, obviously, that Larry Elder was defeated. It's a big shame because Larry Elder, of course, really had, I thought, initially a terrific message, but then he was attacked at so many different sides. I mean, he just didn't have a chance, obviously. Let me give you an example. We told you yesterday about the LA Times, how they were attacking him in the podcast. Well, of course, Larry Elder found it necessary to try to defend himself. And I think that in a super blue state like California, you ought not try to defend yourself. What you should do is just continue to talk about your issues, which is school choice. I mean, that's really what you should continue to talk about. But Elder fell into that age-old candidate problem when you have a new candidate that's running, and they take the attacks personally, and which is, by the way, understandable. But he takes the attacks personally, and he spends his time on the media talking about the attacks rather than talking about what he wants to do. And that's exactly what Newsom wanted, is to get him off track and redirect. So in the Wall Street Journal, Governor Gavin Newsom wins recall election. Larry Elder receives the most votes among the candidates who vied to replace the Democrat in unsuccessful effort by Republicans. California Governor Gavin Newsom has easily defeated a recall effort led by Republicans and fueled by frustrations over his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, according to a vote projection by the Associated Press. With 62% of the state's precincts partially reporting, 65.9% of California voters chose to keep the Democrat in office, and 34.1% opted to remove him. Well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because what's interesting is Democrats do outnumber Republicans in California 2-1, but it seems to me that the folks who wanted to recall Newsom, clearly there were plenty of Democrats and independents that also voted, and that doesn't look so good for the midterm elections in California. Why is that? Well, because Republicans and independents and upset Democrats did come out and they outperformed that 2-1 ratio. They did. They outperformed the 2-1 ratio so far by about 3 points. And those 3 points are going to make a big difference in swing elections. Speaking in Sacramento shortly after the race was called Tuesday night, Mr. Newsom called the special election result a victory for his pandemic policies, which he frequently touted in the closing weeks of the campaign. Quote, "No is not the only thing that was expressed tonight," Mr. Newsom said. "We said yes to science." Jeez. "We said yes to vaccines. We said yes to ending this pandemic." Didn't he also say yes to the French Laundry? Didn't he also say yes to you couldn't go on a beach in California? Remember, they had surfers in California last year, and the police were on the beach calling them in, saying they were going to arrest them if they kept surfing because of the pandemic. You couldn't go outside on a beach, even though getting sunshine was one of the best things for you. And he did a good job. You know, sometimes the people in the state get what they deserve. At least, you know, the people who don't know any better. And naturally, I feel awful for the 34% that voted against Newsom that are probably wondering at this point, how bad do things really have to get? How bad do they really have to get before people will wake up and finally vote for someone who's going to fix things rather than just for party? I mean, when will that happen? And I don't blame you. And I bet you that this recall election is going to accelerate the exodus from California of common sense people, because obviously they can move to any number of nearby states and improve their lifestyle to the extent that they can work remotely, as we did talk about yesterday. So I'm hoping Larry Elder runs again, because Newsom is up for re-election, I believe, next year. I hope Elder runs again. I hope he does. But he's going to have to sharpen his message and not try to defend himself and spend his time doing that. He needs to spend his time talking about the key issues and the key principles. And that, of course, is a normal mistake by a candidate, a first-time candidate. Very normal. You know, it's, I can't believe you said that about me. I'm going to spend all of my time on the media talking about how that's not true. That's what they want you to do, folks. That's what Democrats do. They make things up. What did you think that they did? What did they do to Donald Trump for 4 years? Right? He's a Russian asset. and then they went ahead and impeached him for it. Right? He's a Russian asset. I mean, they're doing the same thing. This is their playbook across America. They try to get you off message because they don't have one. So get this, podcast listeners. A professor assaults a student just because the student is holding a different opinion. So the professor faces years in prison, potentially, after allegedly bloodying the face of an anti-vax mandate student. A professor has been charged with assault after allegedly bloodying the face of a student who engaged in a peaceful demonstration against the idea of vaccine mandates on campus. Just another day in dystopia, right? And by the way, this is in the Western Journal. On August 27th, students and faculty at Pennsylvania State University held a rally advocating for a COVID-19 vaccine mandate. So there was, on Pennsylvania State University, there was a rally, and there were students and professors who wanted a vaccine mandate. Pretty funny, huh? Professors who are supposed to teach critical thinking skills and about freedom. And this is the ultimate place in your life when you're supposed to be free, is when you're on campus. And if you're vaccinated, why do you care anyway, if you're a professor, about who isn't? But nonetheless, they want mandates. As the school is one of the few Big Ten conference schools that have yet to make the requirement for vaccine mandates on campus. You read that right. This was a rally calling for a mandate, presumably attended by people who had all, out of their own free will, been vaccinated themselves, as is well within their right to do so. Yet, they were not satisfied with the ability to get vaccinated and were there to demand that school administrators demand that everyone else get vaccinated too. So when a counter-protester from the student group, Penn State Resistance, showed up to hold up a sign opposing the proposition of a mandate, things got heated. The Epoch Times reported that 36-year-old professor Walter Oliver Baker has been charged with assault, a second-degree misdemeanor, disorderly conduct, a third-degree misdemeanor, and harassment after he allegedly got into a scuffle with Avery Rockland, the leader of Penn State Resistance, over the latter's anti-mandate sign. You know, once again, it was in the 1960s, podcast listeners, that the Democrats were the resistance. They were the resistance on campus. And in many cases, you had professors with them being the resistance against the Vietnam War and, you know, anti-everything, of course. Now it's the Republicans who are the resistance against a Stalinist state and Stalinist universities, and the professors are all for the Stalinism. It's completely flipped the opposite way. Baker, the professor, could be facing a fine up to $5,000 and up to 2 years in prison. A video posted to Twitter appears to show the incident in which a man identified as Baker is seen appearing to snatch the counter-protester's sign away from him before pulling him to the ground. So Rockland, who is the protester, he's the anti-vax guy, the freedom guy. By the way, that's what we should say now. You're not anti-vax, you're pro-freedom. Rockland was reportedly seen being led away by campus police after the alleged incident with a bloodied face. So the student had a bloodied face as a result of the professor. And, you know, the police, of course, take him away too. Baker's faculty bio, the professor, describes him as a professor of English and African American studies who specializes in critical race theory. Not critical thinking, critical race theory, which is antithetical to critical thinking. Baker's areas of research include critical ethnic studies, 19th century American literature and culture, critiques of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, and histories of African, Native, Chicanics, and working class liberation movements, the bio reads. So I got to read this again. This professor, Baker, his areas of research include critical ethnic studies, 19th century American literature and culture, critiques of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, and histories of African, Native, Chicanics, and working class liberation movements, the bio reads. As you can imagine, Such an accomplished radical could most certainly not be expected to remain calm when confronted with the existence of a person who held a different opinion about campus vaccine requirements. So, we have a rally in favor of mandatory vaccinations and a professor who specializes in critical race theory, so the introduction of a counter-protester who dared to express opposition was basically asking for trouble and not allowed. It was bound to get violent and confrontational because these are the people who actually believe in using force or flat-out violence against the groups who will not comply and their demands for society, with their demands for society. The fact that someone was bound to snap is all the more reason why these kinds of demonstrations should and must occur. We cannot continue to let the ideological bullies win, and it's good that this professor is being held accountable for his actions if he did indeed assault the student, which it sure the heck looks like it when you see it on the Twitter video, which I believe we have. Don't we, Christopher? Let's play it. Here it is. Just listen.
Josh Portney, we got the student. This event was organized by the... Okay.
Fuck off! Get the fuck off! You're the one who shot my poster, bro.
So you heard the language, and basically this student was being attacked. It's on video. I would imagine you could probably improve and enhance the video to see Mr. Baker or Professor Baker there. Yes, we must call him Professor, even though he's, of course, accomplished nothing in his life. Certainly nothing with any of his studies, because none of them are useful. But nonetheless, this is what he does, the professor. He attacks this guy. It's on video. And these folks are losing their minds. I mean, they are just crazy. I don't understand why it is in modern America that the people that lack the critical thinking skills are the professors. I mean, they're the ones that are supposed to be teaching it, which we've talked about, I know, before in podcasts. But as this progresses, as the pandemic progresses, as people have more time on their hands, I think, and they're spending more time at home, whether they're working from home remotely or whether they are unemployed, and they're going online and they're spending more time researching what's actually happening in America, they're finding out that our universities are pretty messed up places. Not all of them, obviously, but many of them are really incredible, messed up places. So, podcast listeners, there's this great opinion piece about the stimulus bills and the windfalls of the stimulus bills to local governments and towns and cities. And this is important. And I'm really proud to say this is something that I brought up to my local government, and I brought it up to them a year ago. I even brought it up to the governor of Maryland and to his staff. And it unfortunately went nowhere there, because there were very few people who are willing to truly push this envelope when it really comes down to it. And by the way, that includes Democrats, obviously, and Republicans. So this WSJ opinion is about towns and cities should use their stimulus windfalls, all that stimulus money that they're getting, to cut taxes. So I'm going to just read a portion of this, and I'm going to tell you what I think about this. It says states can't do it, but there's nothing stopping local governments from issuing refunds to the taxpayers. Since the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act in March, state policymakers have fiercely debated how to spend nearly $200 billion in stimulus funds. Few Americans, however, have heard plans for the $130 billion that went to cities and counties. Despite concerns during the pandemic that the economic downturn would bankrupt local governments, we now know that they don't need this windfall. Local governments actually saw an increase in tax revenue in 2020 thanks to growing property taxes. And they are looking at a bumper tax year in 2021 for the same reason. States should push these cities and counties to return the stimulus money to taxpayers by allowing citizens to vote on any new spending. The stimulus legislation forbade states to use the money to cut taxes. It was silent on local government tax cuts, but did say those funds should be used for the relief of households and for spurring local economies. So there you go. So the stimulus legislation had rules. It forbade states to use the money to cut taxes. So the states couldn't cut taxes after they got this big check from the federal government. But it was silent, the stimulus bill was silent on local government tax cuts, but did say those funds could be used for the relief of households and for spurring local economies. Nothing would accomplish these tasks better than cutting property and sales taxes, the two biggest sources of local revenue. Not only is stimulus unnecessary for most local governments, it was distributed nonsensically. The act gave money to counties and small cities based solely on their population, and to large cities based on an antiquated formula from the 1970s that benefits bluer cities in the Northeast and Midwest. Well, obviously, the Democrats are in charge. That's what you would expect. Congress didn't consider the vast diversity of local governments when it crafted the bill. Counties or special districts in some states handle a large portion of local spending. In others, these governments handle little. Even within the same states, some counties and cities perform a lot of government functions. Others outsource the work to other local government bodies. The stimulus formula took none of this into account. So the moral of this article and the thesis of the article, this opinion article by Judge Glock, is local governments have received $130 billion during the pandemic as relief money with not a whole lot of strings. And those local governments should use that money instead to just return it to the people. Okay, I think that's a decent idea. But I actually have an alternative idea. I think the money should be used for school choice. So $130 billion is game changing. I know our local government, I think, received something in the neighborhood over the past year and a half, north of $10 million, I believe, our local government. And I have to get that exact number. And I asked the local government a number of times, what are you going to use the money for? And, we have lots of plans and projects that we got to pay for. And, there are some strings attached. Well, of course, there are some strings attached to the stimulus money. But when you have schools that are closed, why can't you use that money for that purpose? Folks, here is the greater argument. Why aren't Republicans being more creative at the local government level and using this as an opportunity to implement school choice in every nook and cranny of the country? I understand if you have a blue county and a blue small town that those, politicians are probably not going to go for that idea. But we have so many red counties and so many red small towns across the country that could do just that. That could say, you know what? I know my state is blue, but my county is red. And since my county is red, we're going to use our stimulus money to give it to the people who want to send their kids to private school. And those who are going to continue to send their kids to public school, maybe there's some other option. Maybe just give that excess money to the public school. So there's parity. Okay, so there's parity. But Republicans aren't implementing this idea. And why aren't they? And I think the reason is they are so tied into their bureaucracy in their local governments. I mean, every government has bureaucracy. Every local government has bureaucracy, just like every state does, just like every city does, just like every federal government does. But when you have a local bureaucracy as well, that bureaucracy is always coming after you as the elected official and asking for the next project to be done. So the person ahead of your park service is like, we need a brand new park. And you actually might need a brand new park at some point in the future. But what's more important, the children and giving them options and having this money follow them? So here's the argument that I've heard from local governments when I brought this up. And I've been bringing this up, by the way, for over a year, I'd say since February, March of last year. So a year and a half. They're going to say, well, this stimulus money is just temporary, right? It's not going to be repeated next year because the pandemic, is obviously going to end and is indeed ending. Democrats don't want it to end, but it's indeed ending. And they're going to say, since that money isn't going to be coming back to us year after year, how would we fund school choice next year? And this shows you how much Republicans lack strategy, podcast listeners. Republicans just don't understand how to strategize, in my opinion, to advance our principles. Yes, those arguments of us not getting money, counties and small towns and states and small cities and large cities getting the stimulus money next year are probably correct. But guess what's going to happen if you use the stimulus money this year to give to people for school choice? Those people are going to come back to you next year and say, where's my money for school choice? You're going to say, well, we didn't get the stimulus money. And now you have a debate that is going to happen at the local government level about how we want to continue this program. And now we can have a conversation about how to continue the program. And now you're leveraging your constituency in your county, Democrats, Republicans, independents, Black, white, Hispanic alike, all of whom benefit from school choice, I believe. And they're going to advocate at the state level in blue states and at the city level in blue cities and elsewhere across the country and say, I want school choice to continue. How do we fund it so that it can continue? But Republicans haven't done this. They've had this free money handed to them from the federal government at the local level. And they've decided instead to just spend it on stuff for the most part. How does that make them any different from Democrats? And Democrats, if you're in charge of a blue county, for example, in my state, there are a number of blue counties. Obviously, it's a blue state. And a couple of blue counties have 1 million people each in those blue counties. They're large. Imagine if the 1 million people in that blue county found out that a county adjacent to them was using the stimulus money for school choice. And of course they would find out. And there's nothing stopping the local governments from using the money for that purpose. And then those blue counties and the people that are living in them say, well, wait a minute. I mean, I know I vote for Democrats all the time, but actually that's a pretty good idea what that local county is doing that's right next to us, right up the street. I like that idea a lot. Let's do that here. It starts to gain momentum, podcast listeners. And that's exactly what we need to do. We, for whatever reason, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, doesn't seem to have any game, any strategy. They continue to operate under the rules set by Democrats, which is, here's the money, now just go spend it on the stuff that we always spent it on in the past. Rather than, how about we really start investing in children? How about we really start investing in competition? How about we really start investing in critical thinking skills, which are lacking in public schools and lacking in America's public colleges as well as private colleges? It has to start from childhood education. And private schools, charter schools, school choice, as we've said ad nauseum on this program, has got to happen. And it still can, because if the Biden administration passes even a $1.5 trillion bill instead of a $3.5 trillion bill, if they just pass half of the bill, $1.75 trillion, you know there's going to be another huge windfall to local governments and local towns and local cities. And those red districts, those red counties, those red towns need to do what I just laid out for you. And if you live in such a place, and I know many do, please talk to your local officials and get the facts. Say to them, hey, what are the strings attached to the money that you're getting from the federal government? And by the way, make sure you read what those strings are, because oftentimes the local government officials, even Republicans, aren't going to tell you the truth. They're going to say, oh, you know, that money is all spoken for. That's not what I asked, Mr. County Commissioner. That's not what I asked, Mr. County Executive. What I asked was, is the money restricted on how it can be used? And if so, what are those restrictions? And then the next question is, why aren't you using it for school choice? Well, it's because we don't have school choice in our state. We don't allow that. Yeah, I didn't ask you that. You're the local government. You can use the money for school choice at the local level. because it's free money. And these are the Republicans that aren't doing this. Obviously, as I've said before, we know the Democrats aren't going to willingly do this. They're not going to. They can't, because they are stuck in a corner with the teachers union having a gun against their head. You will lose if you go against the teachers union in a blue county or a blue district and you advocate for school choice. But I got to tell you something. In those counties in my state where they have 1 million people in them, most of the kids are stuck in pretty crappy schools. There are some good schools, of course, there always are, but they just don't work like they used to. And this is a huge opportunity for the Republican Party. So for all of you podcast listeners, please talk to your local government officials about this and don't accept their explanation of all the reasons they cannot make it happen, because it isn't so. So next up, podcast listeners, Norm MacDonald obviously passes away at the age of 61. I know you've heard this on the mainstream news. What you haven't heard is Norm MacDonald on The View. So Norm MacDonald was on The View in 2000. I have here 2020, 21 years ago. We just talked about that. Norm MacDonald was on The View 21 years ago in the year 2000. And he was their guest. And naturally, he has the typical Norm MacDonald comedic act, which is to not conform with comedy, something that is, by the way, badly missing today, which we'll talk about. But first, before we go to the View clip, I want to read from the Daily Wire about Norm MacDonald, a certain section of this, which really speaks to who he was as a comedian. It says, a friend of MacDonald's, Lori Jo Hoekstra, said the Weekend Update anchor had been fighting cancer for nearly a decade, but was determined to keep his struggle away from family, friends, and fans. He was most proud of his comedy, said Hoekstra, who was with MacDonald when he passed. Quote, he never wanted the diagnosis to affect the way the audience or any of his loved ones saw him. Norm was a pure comic. He once wrote that, quote, a joke should catch someone by surprise. It should never pander. He certainly never pandered, and Norm will be missed terribly. Well, that really, really speaks for itself, because that's exactly what Norm did, of course, on Saturday Night Live, which is largely why he was fired, because he wouldn't say jokes that the producers and the director, I believe, wanted. In other words, he kept talking about O.J. Simpson, then ultimately they fired him because of course, the brass is saying, you can't say jokes about O.J. Simpson. You got to stop it. And Norm's like, okay. So then he would go out there and he'd say a joke about O.J. Simpson, and he gets fired. So to prove that he was his own man, this is a clip that was sent to me by a very good friend of mine. And I'm really pleased that he found this, because it's from 21 years ago on The View with Barbara Walters. Oh my God. Remember Barbara Walters? And you're going to love it. Remember what happened in 2000. In 2000, there was a presidential race between George Bush and Al Gore. And Al Gore, podcast listeners, sued, of course, because he said he won the election because of all the hanging chads in South Florida. Once again, Democrats can't seem to count ballots and always find a way to keep the counting going way after the election. And that all started in the year 2000 in Gore v. Bush. And so Norm MacDonald goes on The View in the middle of this recount in November of 2020, right after the election, and talks about it. And it's not what the people on The View wanted to talk about. Incredibly politically incorrect. How many clips do we have on this? We just have the one clip. It's just slightly less than a minute. And here it is.
Well, I hope that the Democrats don't steal the election from the winner, you know, but who knows?
You like George Bush, don't you?
I love George Bush, man. He's a good man, decent. You know, none of this. He's, he's not a liar, a crook, murderer, or anything like that. So it'd be good to get the. See, I think we should get the homicide out of the White House and get like a fresh start, because we don't want any more murderers.
I think we should just go on to the next question.
Oh.
Who's murderers? Yeah.
Oh, Clinton, he murdered a guy.
Yeah, you know, you're not allowed to put out no accusations without.
That's a little too far.
That's the way it does work.
Let's just go on to the next question.
Yeah.
This is not my week. What can I tell you?
Oh, it's not mine either, and I'm being very nice, okay? Be a good boy. Now, Norm.
Do you never hear that?
No. Listen,
Norm,
we don't need
I don't want to get into this, and I don't want to hear it, and this is not the place to make those accusations. And you're supposed to be funny. Let's get on to the next question. Get with it.
That is classic Norm MacDonald. Comedy that makes the people uncomfortable. And he makes people on both sides uncomfortable. There, he made Barbara Walters and all the people on The View incredibly uncomfortable because he's talking about something that he maybe believes or doesn't believe, but he just does it nonetheless to make them uncomfortable. And of course, Barbara Walters ends that segment that you just heard with, well, this is not something that we can talk about. We just can't talk about this. I mean, we need you to be funny. Ah, podcast listeners, this is where this has all started. This all started in 2000 because first, Democrats didn't know how to count ballots and continue to count way after the election, Gore v. Bush. And then with Norm MacDonald on The View in the year 2000 talking about it, and Barbara Walters like, well, you need to be funny. You need to, and funny is only when you make fun of Republicans. You can't make fun of and use satirical comments about Bill Clinton. You can't do that. You can't suggest that people were dropping like flies around the Clintons and have been all their lives. And that somehow that's probably not a coincidence. You can't do that. And you can't do it in a joking way to make people laugh, which is all he was doing. And it was funny. But classic Norm MacDonald, because he makes people uncomfortable in a comedic way. You can't do that today, podcast listeners. Can you? You can't. You cannot have that kind of humor today. You will be canceled. You can only go on the major networks and on programs like The View if you say the right jokes, the correct jokes, the approved jokes. And Barbara Walters, always a lefty, made it very clear at the end of that segment. You need to be funny. That's not funny. You're making fun of, there was a time when that was funny to make fun of both sides who were in the White House just because that's what you did. And you said whatever you wanted to say, and that's what made us uniquely American. But of course, I feel as though Norm MacDonald was that guy who didn't care because he knew he could be canceled and maybe go bankrupt and never get another job and didn't give a shit. I mean, that's pretty amazing. There's no other way of saying it. So next up, podcast listeners, go woke or go broke. So there's a store that's based in Texas, but it's in multiple states, and it's a chain. It's called Buc-ee's, Bucees. And Buc-ee's sells all kinds of stuff, and it's a pretty large store, including they sell gas too. And there is the Houston Chronicle article from Sarah Martinez. And I kept trying to figure out if this is an opinion piece or not, but it's not. It's in their politics section. So it's not an opinion piece. And it's Sarah Martinez, a writer for the Houston Chronicle, that is trying to cancel Buc-ee's because of the fact that the owner gives to Governor Abbott and Texas Republicans. This was just in their newspaper. How much Buc-ee's owner has donated to Governor Abbott and Texas Republicans. The article reads as follows. Arch Beaver Applin III. How you like that? Arch, quote, Beaver. That's what his friends call him. Applin III, owner of Texas-based gas station chain Buc-ee's, has backed the Texas GOP for some time, even publicly supporting members of the state's Republican Party. How terrible. In 2014, some Texans were upset. There was even talk of a boycott after Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick boasted about having Applin's support for his primary election win. But now, A Texan's recent look into Applin's financial support of the GOP has some considering a boycott. They're going to boycott him because he gives to the Republicans in Texas, of all places. Earlier this month, a woman named Julie Zweig warned Texans in a Facebook post about Applin's donations to various members of the Texas Republican Party, sharing how much money he's given to the GOP since 2015. The numbers are publicly available by Transparency USA, a database that discloses money in relation to state politics. According to the database, Applin has given to 20 Republican PACs, including the governor, Greg Abbott, Attorney General Ken Paxton, Speaker of the Texas House, Dade Phelan, and former Speaker Dennis Bonnen. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Applin has given the most to Abbott. He's given $1,025,000 to be exact. Donations to other PACs range from $1,000 to $375,000. Since July 14th, Applin has donated $490,000, more than half of those donations going toward Abbott's PAC. Concerned Texans shared thoughts on the matter, with many calling for a boycott of the chain. This is the writer saying this. Concerned Texans. I mean, obviously it's a lefty writer. So Michelle Cochran, 72, tweets out, "Boycott Buc-ee's. Arch Applin III, the owner of Buc-ee's, has donated more than $1 million to Greg Abbott since 2015, and he's donated to Dan Patrick and Ken Paxton too. I used to love stopping at Buc-ee's on the road trips anywhere in Texas, but not anymore. Please share." And then Ash tweets out, "The owner of Buc-ee's gives large sums of money to Greg Abbott, so that's disappointing." Angie M, "Well, lost my favorite pit stop in Texas. No more Buc-ee's for me. That $1 million plus donation for Abbott is the owner of Buc-ee's, and I've spent a lot of money there through the years. But no more. Done. And so, of course, she, also has a screenshot of Arch Applin III, the owner of Buc-ee's, and the amount of total donations, which are $1,673,500 to Republicans. But there's another reason why Democrats want to cancel Buc-ee's, podcast listeners. It's not just because the owner gives to Democrats, and that's why we're doing this particular Go Woke or Go Broke about this uniquely Texan store. It's also in neighboring states too, but it's uniquely Texan because that's where it's based. And it's because of what they sell. Because you see, Buc-ee's sells things like beef jerky, and they sell all different kinds of sweet drinks, and they sell ice cream, and they sell stuff for farms, and it's just like all different kinds of a mishmash of things that they sell, but it's all stuff that probably you would want to buy in red counties. And those stores, by the way, I love going in those kinds of stores. I really enjoy it. They're a lot of fun. And I'm sure that the Democrats are probably really jealous because I think secretly they enjoy going in there too, but they don't want any of their friends to see them going in. But now this gives them a reason to try to cancel Buc-ee's because it's like, well, I really like that store, but now I'm going to really cancel them because the guy's a Republican. Why is that a surprise that a guy that owns a store, a chain like this, would actually be Republican? I mean, first of all, it's in Texas. Secondly, it's kind of a gas station / big Costco kind of store that sells all this stuff for farms, as I said, and then sells stuff that people that live in the country and I'm one of them that like. And so it's ridiculous. I just don't see very many Republicans talking about canceling and cancel culture, canceling Democrats because of the money that they give or the store that they own or trying to run them out of business. And that's why we do this Go Woke or Go Broke segment, because the Go Woke or Go Broke segment is about discovering and disclosing who these people are who are trying to cancel these small business people. And Buc-ee's, fine. I mean, I don't know how many stores they have. Maybe it's dozens, but it's still not like a massive big business. And yet it's not enough. Democrats have to cancel you. They have to run you out of business because you happen to live in a red county and you like to go to Buc-ee's and get beef jerky. That shouldn't be allowed. And you probably are driving an SUV and filling it up with lots of gas, lots of petroleum. Shouldn't be permitted. I mean, why live in Texas? Why do you live in Texas, Democrats, if you hate the people that you're around? Because the vast majority of people in Texas are just wonderful Americans who just want freedom and just want to be left alone. They want open spaces. They want to be able to live their lives freely. They don't want you to tell them what to do. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And so we had another segment this podcast, and it's about how Dan Crenshaw wrecks Bernie. We don't have time to do that. And we also had one that, in addition to that talks about the Texas border wall, which we're going to hit next podcast because Texas has decided, podcast listeners, to use $1 billion of taxpayer money in Texas to build the border wall. And maybe, you know what we should probably try to find out is maybe Texas is using all that stimulus money that came from the federal government that's supposed to, it's like, well, thank you, Biden administration. We're going to use it to finish the wall in Texas. Well done. Well done. I'm not sure if that's the case, but wouldn't that be a real kick if that's what they did? In any event, that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Really appreciate you listening to Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Parler, Rumble, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.